There are many things that can sway someone's opinion on a game. A deal breaker for one might be what makes the game for another. For me, whether or not I enjoy a game really boils down to 5 main sections: characters, story, exploration and/or world building, combat, and music. Not necessarily in that order. Now, without further ado, let's get into my thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI. Now, I'm just gonna directly state right here that I love this game. It made its way into my top 3 Final Fantasies very, very quickly, literally within the first quarter of the game, and there's very little about the game that I didn't enjoy now that I've officially finished it. With that out of the way, you all know what to expect with this little video. Now, I'm gonna get a little bit of preamble out of the way as well, just before we really get into it. Final Fantasy XV was the last mainline title in the Final Fantasy series, and it came out back in 2016. If you were a fan of the series at the time, you know that the final product was not at all like what was promoted over the course of almost 10 years. And as such, it was a bit of a disappointment upon release for many fans. Similarly, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy was not very popular upon release, and while I've seen opinions warm up to 15, 13 didn't have the same courtesy. Even Final Fantasy XIV, despite being insanely popular and very fun now, was not an instant hit upon release. The point of me saying all this is that the past decade has not been great for Final Fantasy, and as such, when news of Final Fantasy XVI dropped back in 2020, and subsequently when every trailer was released, there were generally 2 groups of reactions: people who were very, very excited, and people who were very, very doubtful that this game would actually be good. I was ecstatic. I changed all my profile pics to Clive and Joshua, and I was like, I'm not gonna change them until this game comes out, and I eagerly awaited news of a release date. I was sure that this was going to be the best Final Fantasy in the last decade. I knew it. And I prayed a little bit too, listening to the naysayers, because I was pretty worried that if 16 flopped, it might be the last new title for a long time, what with remakes making more money. Needless to say, despite trying to curb my excitement, my expectations were quite high. That's what I really want to emphasize with this, is I had very high expectations for this game. And still, Final Fantasy XVI managed to blow me away with how absolutely amazing it is. So with my personal rant out of the way, I'm going to say right now that if you haven't played the game yet, or you're in the middle of the game and you managed to avoid spoilers, then go! Shoot! Go finish it, it's worth it. Now, seeing as the game is just over a month old, this video's format is going to be a little different from all my other ones, because normally I spoil the game to hell and back. So in this first section, I'm going to give a general overview of the story and world, and I'm going to talk about the combat in full detail, so if you don't want to know about the combat, then don't listen to that section. In the spoiler section, which I will warn you of, that's where I'm just going to talk about everything else. Each section will be marked for your convenience and navigation, and thus you have been warned, so you cannot blame me for spoilers. So with that out of the way, Final Fantasy XVI is a politically driven game. The general story is that those who are born with magic are called bearers, and they are taken and branded from birth and enslaved until they die, usually from using too much magic. On the off chance that they happen to not be slaves, they are generally treated very poorly by the general population. Outside of these bearers, the only other way to access magic is through crystals, which can only be mined from the 5 large mother crystals that are scattered across the realm. As such, there is a lot of fighting between countries over resources, and at the helms of this fighting are something called dominants. Dominants are essentially people who are possessed by an icon, which, if you've played Final Fantasy before, you might recognize some of them as summons from previous games. For example, Rosaria, our main country, is helmed by the Phoenix. Dhalmekia has Titan at the head, Sanbreque has Bahamut at the head, and Waloed has Odin at the head, and so on and so forth. So these bearers and dominants are essentially treated as weapons of war in the ongoing resource crisis. And that is all I will say until I am allowed to spoil things. Now, if you think the plot I described to you sounds a little generic, that's because it kind of is. Slavery or oppression of a group, and thus the goal of the story to be liberation, is quite common in fantasy stories. However, Final Fantasy XVI has enough mystery going to keep the story interesting, not to mention that the game does a phenomenal job of keeping you on the edge of your seat from the very beginning. The pacing of the story is excellent, and without getting into details, every single one of the characters carries the story in a way that takes my breath away from a writing standpoint. Honestly, I would tell everyone to play the game for our main 3 characters alone, because there were several points in the game where I literally had to stop myself from getting my notebook out to just start writing notes about them because I wanted this review to be like a cohesive thing of like my opinions at the end and not just like me going batshit about characters and like foils and stuff like that. So I didn't do that, but yeah, the characters are just so good. Furthermore, something I really enjoy about Final Fantasy XVI is how accessible it is to all types of video game players. I generally split up Final Fantasy games into two groups, that being ones that follow more of a save the crystals, magical plot, and those that follow a more politically driven story. The two most prominent examples of the latter are Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy Tactics. And as someone who plays video games at a bit of a leisurely pace, read it can take me up to 4 months to beat one game, I have a lot of trouble with keeping track of what exactly is happening in terms of who's who and what's going on. If you're like me in that regard, then fear not. Despite the land of Valistea being home to 5 different countries / provinces / different bodies of people who are all doing different things at different times, the game actually makes it very easy to follow. And on the off chance that you do forget, the game offers essentially the data log from Final Fantasy XIII in case you get confused. Now, that might have turned some of you off just now, especially if you remember how much the data log destroyed the pacing and immersion in 13. Well, they actually make it a lot better in this game. Rather than throwing 20 different reports at you at once that you have to read in order to understand what's going on, the game generally gives you the information you need in the cutscene, and if you get confused or you want to read up on it more, it has something called an active lore menu that only shows you the important terms for that cutscene. If you need a refresher on previous chapters or characters, then there is an in-depth menu you can access with all that information as well. For me personally, this made it a lot easier to follow along with who was who at the beginning of the game until I learned to differentiate on my own. So if the political Final Fantasies threw you off before because you have a goldfish brain like me, then fear not. I bring this data log-esque thing up for another reason, and that is that the realm is very, very rich in lore and world building. So much so that despite having enough of an understanding to enjoy the story of the game, I found myself back in the archives multiple times to reread character bios and go over the events of the political climate for each chapter of the game to see if I missed something. It's not necessary, you don't need to understand what's going on, but it really helped me feel like I was in the game with the characters. Seeing as I've gushed enough about that for now, let's get into the combat. As a Kingdom Hearts fan, I expected to like the combat, but I didn't expect it to be as satisfying and engaging as it is. Our main man Clive can do all the usual action game stuff like parrying and dodging and such, but he also has access to 8 different icons by the end of the game. Each one gives you access to 4 different abilities as well as 1 iconic feat, which is essentially a 5th ability that is exclusive to that icon. You can set 2 abilities to each icon and 3 icons to Clive at any given time. While the iconic feat cannot be changed, any mastered ability can be set to any icon, meaning there's a lot of different ways to set your character up. My personal setup was Phoenix, because Phoenix Shift reigns supreme, with Heat Wave and Flames of Rebirth, Bahamut with Impulse and Giga Flare, and then Rama, I am aware that this is not the correct pronunciation, but I'm not changing it, with Pile Drive and Judgment Bolt. And it hard carried me through the game. I was destroying shit, bud. As I said earlier about the story being very accessible to players, the combat is as well. There are 2 options you can choose, either story or action focused in terms of difficulty. I personally played on action mode. There are also items called Rings of Accessibility, which did things such as auto-control Clive a little bit or control Torgal, your doggy teammate, which just made things a little easier if you needed it. On the flip side, you could also make the game quite difficult for yourself if you didn't use any accessories or try to do boss fights with no healing items. That's what I was doing by the end of the game for the added challenge, and it made it so fun. I really like when games give you a very broad range of difficulty, because for me personally, I found the game to be a decent challenge with the restrictions I put on myself, and so I enjoyed it. But I'm also glad that those options were there for me if I struggled, because at the end of the day, I play Final Fantasy for the story and characters. The combat's just a bonus. It's also a good thing because I've developed some really awesome carpal tunnel in my wrist, so I literally can't play the game for an extended period of time. So I don't know how I would have done if the combat was exceedingly difficult or the battles were exceedingly long. In terms of comparison, I think Final Fantasy XVI is just like if Strangers of Paradise met Final Fantasy XIII and then got refined. That's the combat system, because especially 13.3 Lightning Returns, because I think that one's probably the most similar to how Clive is set up in Final Fantasy XVI. And honestly, that makes me really happy because I really enjoy the stagger system, and I found that it was a bit clunky in 13, so I love it when games kind of take less good systems, or like systems that were kind of like unrefined and then they make them better like they did for 16. So yeah, regular combat gets major props. The other aspect of combat were the icon battles, which were really big, flashy battles that start when Clive says, "Come to me, Ifrit." I didn't like these battles so much. Don't get me wrong, they look really cool, like the visuals blew me away. But I wasn't personally a huge fan of flying around the screen because I had trouble like perceiving how close I was to the enemy. So in other words, it was purely a personal thing. Like that's probably the only negative thing I have to say about the game outside of like the font being too small for my blind ass. And I never found a way to make it bigger, but both things are just like, that was totally a me problem. Like there are probably people out there who love doing the icon fights. So, what have we learned so far? This game is really good, and it's very accessible, so if you're even remotely interested in it, or you're kind of on the fence about it, which I have a feeling you are if you're watching this video, then go pick it up. I recommend it, seriously. Because now I'm going to start dropping spoilers, so you have been warned. So go buy the game if you want to, and if not, then I'm just gonna spoil the whole thing for you in about 5 seconds. Alright, so let's get into the story. I mentioned earlier that the story of the game keeps you on the edge of your seat and has amazing pacing. And the way they established that was through the major story beats in the first segment of the game. Within the first hour of our story, we see Clive's father and brother Joshua die in a particularly violent way at Phoenix Gate at the hands of the Sonbrek Empire, which were only there in the first place due to the betrayal of Clive and Joshua's mother, Annabella. Now, if you were watching the trailers leading up to 16 like I was, you might not have been surprised by Joshua's death and subsequently the fact that he wasn't actually dead, because it was very heavily hinted at due to the fact that he is a phoenix. But if you weren't watching the trailers and you weren't expecting it, then you probably experienced something that I like to call the Game of Thrones effect. It's when a major character dies in such a shocking way that it gives you the feeling that no one is safe and anything could go wrong at any moment. Now, I personally think that if Joshua's death didn't give you that feeling, then Sid's death at Drake's Head did, because that was when it hit me. Sid was the guy. He was Clive's mentor, he freed bears and saved people, he was the guy who showed Clive kindness when he needed it and kicked his ass when he needed that. He was the one who kick-started the whole damn rebellion, like he started our damn story. He was our leading man, if you will. And he dies in like the first barely quarter of the game, just like that, like holy shit. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was my Game of Thrones moment. I spent the entire story after that with my controller gripped in my hands, watching these characters that were so dear to me and hoping beyond hope that they weren't the next to die. And that brings me to my next point of the characters themselves. Clive and Joshua Rossfield, as well as Jill Warwick, are our main characters. Clive is the firstborn son of Duke Elwyn of Rosaria and a failed son in the eyes of his mother because he doesn't host the icon Phoenix. Instead, he's the first shield or main protector to his brother Joshua, who does host the Phoenix and is very sickly. When we first meet Clive, he's at the lowest point in his life. He's been a slave to the Empire for the last 13 years because of the events of Phoenix Gate, and the only thing that's been keeping him going is the dream that he will avenge his brother who was murdered 13 years prior by a mysterious second icon of fire. Then he finds out that the second icon of fire he's been hunting all these years was himself all along. And suddenly, the only thing keeping him going is gone, just like that. Seeing Clive go from this broken person who is aimless and alone and is being crushed under the weight of his own guilt, to the leader who fights to save the world from a malevolent god by the end of the game is so satisfying. Seeing the bonds he has with Joshua, with Jill, the developing bonds with all of the other characters at the Hideaway is what makes the game as good as it is. The characters feel real, despite being put through situations that most of us definitely haven't experienced. Like, sure, we've never killed the guy who turned us into a war weapon like Jill has, we've never been enslaved like Clive has, and, you know, like we generally haven't gone through that. But many of us can relate to loving a sibling as unconditionally as Clive and Joshua do, to promising to love and stick by someone despite what the future holds like Clive and Jill do. Many of us understand what losing a loved one is like, how even after they're gone, there's still so much that reminds us of them. The characters all might bear fantastical powers and be caught up in crazy fights with godlike abilities, but at the base of it all, they're still very much grounded in reality, and that, at its heart, is what makes them so compelling. I think what also makes the characters stand out to me is just how developed so many of them are, and how even though the main themes of duty and responsibility and of revenge and of just, losing loved ones is so common in all of their stories, they still all manage to stand apart from one another. It isn't just our main three that this applies to, it extends to the entire cast of side characters: Mid, Gav, Karen, Eloise, Theodore, Quentin, Isabel, Martha, Wade. Like, the list just goes on and on and on. Even characters like Captain Doris, who you probably don't even remember who that is if you did play the game, are well written. She's almost a direct parallel to the main female character, Jill. They were both taken in as young children and made into weapons to be used, only setting themselves free in adulthood. The ending of Doris' story with her master is so compelling to me because it's a direct opposite of Jill. Jill killed her master to prevent him from ever making her or anyone else a weapon ever again, while Doris let her master live and subsequently her business be ruined because she refused to be the killer that her master turned her into. Both options were a valid emotional response to the anger and frustration they felt, but it showed what each character needed at the time to feel like they were on the path to atonement. And I think, again, even though base thing was revenge, they wanted revenge against their masters, it was just seeing the end result for the two of them just showed that they're two different characters. There was never a direct parallel drawn between Doris and Jill, but god damn if it didn't stick with me as soon as I thought of it. A little off topic, but I also like that Sid was a mentor to Clive and to Jill to an extent, because in World of Final Fantasy, Rama, Ifrit, and Shiva are met together, with Rama acting as like the unofficial mentor to the two of them, and it makes me smile to see that dynamic persist throughout the series. A little thing I will note about the characters is that I honestly can't remember how much character stuff was like directly in the story versus how much was in side quests, because I did every side quest as they popped up, so it kind of blurs together a little. So if you're kind of going into the game expecting the characters to be as good as I'm describing, but you're also like not willing to do the side quests, you might be a little disappointed. But yeah, just that's my warning. But anyways, I digress. In terms of the game overall, I think 16 has probably one of the strongest casts out of any Final Fantasy game. There, I said it. Which brings me to my next talking point, which is the extra stuff in and of itself. Final Fantasy games typically have some kind of mini-game things going on, and Final Fantasy 16 also has that as well. There are the narrative-based side quests, which serve as amazing world and character builders, but there's also various hunts to complete, as well as monolith trials. A lot of the side stuff revolves around the combat, but I honestly didn't see that as an issue, because the combat was fun. The actual side quests, now, I think, despite them being fetch quests and such, I think were instrumental in setting up the tone for the story. Any story that centers around freedom as a main point needs to make the audience care about who we're freeing and why, and I think the side quests played a very huge part in that for me. The crystal retrieval quest at the very start in Martha's Rest served to show how dependent people were on magic and crystals, like how their entire livelihood depended on it. The wolf quest and playthings in the North Fields of Sanbreque showed us just how wrong bearers were being treated. And the quest when we were helping recently freed bearers in Lostwing shows just how long their servitude affects them for. At their heart, each of the quests may have been simple fetch requests, simple, go kill some stuff quests. But the window each one gave us into the lives of our characters was what made me cheer when Clive agreed to help Sid with his plan. With that, it brings us to the music. Sometimes I really wish I kept doing music through high school so I would have the words in my vocabulary to describe why things are good the way they are. And I'm sure there are people out there who could explain why the music is good in this game, but unfortunately it is not me. I will say though, I don't think there was a single bad track in the entire game, and that was evident when they were playing music for the end credits, and I was just like, holy crap, the music is so good. This game made me ugly cry, I think about 4 times, and at least 2 of them that I can remember were just like triggered by the music alone, because when Clive faced his guilt and battled himself and then Joshua like reappeared, oh, it moved me to tears. It's so good. I wish I really wanted to find the track, but I didn't want to Google it because I was scared of getting spoilers. But yeah, it's just, the entire Bahamut sequence, like every single track that played during like the Bahamut fight and the lead up to it was just so good. It was so good. You just have to take my word for it. Now, with all of that out of the way, the very last thing I wanted to discuss was the ending of the game itself. It wasn't bad, but it did leave me feeling very unsatisfied. Final Fantasy XVI is one of the most upfront games in how sad it is. Final Fantasy games in general are pretty dark, but usually they hide it a lot better. Final Fantasy XVI was not about that. It was just front and center the entire way through. It deals with heavy themes of duty and responsibility in direct juxtaposition with free will and freedom. It deals with loss and how those react to it, be it with apathy or revenge or one of the million other ways people react. It deals with war and the consequences of said battles, how it sticks with you years, even decades later. Needless to say, the game is a bit of a bummer. I spent a lot of the game hoping the ending would be a happy one for our characters. Final Fantasy XV was generally a very happy game, and its ending was one of the saddest in the series, so my logic was that by Final Fantasy XVI being a very, very sad game, and also having a direct theme of hope, the ending would be a happy one. Now, that's not to say that I don't enjoy a sad ending. Final Fantasy X is one of my favorite games, after all, and 15 is one of my favorite endings in the series. But what I don't enjoy is an ambiguous ending. Dion, Joshua, and Clive's fates are my point of contention for this. While there is no evidence of Dion being alive at all, so we can conclude that despite us not having confirmation that he's dead, he's most likely dead, that's not the case for Clive and Joshua. Joshua we did see die, and while Clive did something to him, be it cleaning up his body or actually reviving him, we then see the origin explode and Clive end up on a beach somewhere without Joshua, which points to him not being alive. After the Clive beach scene, we cut to the hideaway and Jill sees the star disappear while crying, and that seems like Clive is dead, especially because Gav also starts crying too, but then we don't actually see him die. Then, after the very, very long credits, we see happy children playing in a world where everything we lived through was just an old story. So Clive did succeed at building his new world without magic where people are free to live. So I guess that was your hopeful ending, but the storybook that they're reading is written by Joshua Rossfield. So did he live, or did someone use his name? We're not sure, we don't know, and unless we get some kind of confirmation, we're never going to be sure. And that sucks to me. The ending feels kind of flaky. It's like they couldn't decide if they wanted to be sad or happy, so they just left it up to player interpretation, but to me it just feels incomplete. If anyone has any thoughts on the ending, like your own opinions on it, please comment, with a spoiler warning of course, because I really, really would like to hear how other people interpreted the ending and how they liked it. And just let me be clear here that even though the ending felt unsatisfying for me, it didn't diminish the fact that the rest of the game is a masterpiece. In conclusion, I love this game, I really, really do. It's an emotionally driven masterpiece with a strong cast of characters, an amazing soundtrack, and really fun combat. If you're a Final Fantasy fan who isn't too hung up on turn-based combat, then pick it up. It's just pick the title up. Just do it. It won't disappoint you. If you're an action game fan, pick it up. It won't disappoint you. Unless you like really hard games, then it might disappoint you a little bit. If you're somebody who just likes really good stories in RPGs, pick it up. It's a really good game. That's it for now. So if you need me, I will be doing my Final Fantasy run. Platinum Trophy, here I come. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.